One morning, you wake up and there's an envelope at your door. Inside is what feels like an ultimatum written just to inform you. There's a single sentence. Your rent is being increased by 40% starting next month. And your first thought is, can they actually do this? Don't I have any rights here? Imagine you're in this situation. You've been living in the same apartment for 3 years. You sort of know your neighbors, you've gotten used to your neighborhood, and you love it. You've built your life around that place, and you feel like you belong there. Then an envelope, a piece of paper, and everything has to change. It's a little like being torn from a branch, from the place where you belong. Most people think, in that moment, this can't be legal. There must be some rule. I have rights too. And you're right, there absolutely is a rule, but that rule, most likely, doesn't have the teeth you think it does. Because in American law, there is no single federal statute that determines how much rent can be increased or when it can be increased. There never has been. So that's the law of the country you live in, meaning there is no federal law sheltering you as a tenant under a roof. So what is there? Every state has its own different rules in place. Every city can have its own separate regulations, and your lease, meaning that document you signed, sits right at the center of this equation. So now the real question is this: can your landlord actually raise the rent whenever they want by however much they want? The answer is both yes and no, and what determines which one applies to you comes down to a few details you may have never thought about. What clauses are in the lease you signed? What does the contract say? Which state are you a tenant in? Are you renting month to month, or do you have a yearly lease? These 3 questions completely change whether a landlord can hit you with a 40% increase overnight, and most people only find out the answers after that envelope arrives. Here is how the actual legal rule works. Let's start with the most important distinction. If you signed a 1-year lease, your landlord absolutely cannot raise the rent before that lease ends. Period. Your lease is essentially a barricade, a wall, a shield put in place for you, but only if it's a yearly lease. For the duration of that period, the amount you pay is locked in. If there's a rent increase clause written into the contract, that clause will apply too. So with a yearly lease, the landlord is bound to follow whatever increased terms are already in it. But if you signed a month-to-month agreement, things shift. In that case, the landlord can raise the rent, but not arbitrarily or verbally. They are required to provide written notice, meaning they have to send an envelope, and how many days in advance they must give that notice depends on which state you're in. In most states, it's 30 days, but in California, if the increase is below 10%, it's 30 days, and if it's above 10%, it's 90 days. In Texas, there isn't even a clear legal deadline, so the rules can vary dramatically depending on the state you live in. What about unlimited increases? Can a landlord raise rent by however much they want? Yes, in most states, there is no ceiling on how much rent can be raised. There is no limit constraining the landlord. They can set whatever amount they choose. But there are 2 states where the exceptions begin right here. California and Oregon are the 2 states with statewide rent caps that apply across the board. In California, the annual increase can be at most 5% plus inflation, and that number can never exceed 10% under any circumstances. Oregon has a similar system. Another key protection: a landlord cannot raise rent for discriminatory or retaliatory reasons, meaning they cannot raise it simply because of your race, religion, or disability. That would be a federal violation and is against the law. Similarly, if they raised it purely because you filed a complaint about poor maintenance, that is also considered illegal in most states. And a verbal notice is not valid anywhere. A rent increase notice that is not in writing is legally null and void, meaning it is treated as if it never existed. Now, let's look at how this plays out in real life. Most people who receive that envelope do 2 things. They either panic and move out immediately, or they do nothing and accept the increase. Both can be serious mistakes, because there are things you don't know yet. First, if your landlord told you in person at the door or sent you a text message instead of providing written notice, that is invalid in most states. You should wait for a legally valid written notice before that increase takes effect. Until that notice arrives, your previous rent amount remains in force. Second, if your fixed lease has not yet expired and there is no rent increase clause in the contract, your landlord cannot force you to accept that increase. You can continue paying your original rent until the lease ends, so there is no need to panic. Third, if you are currently serving on active military duty, a federal law called the Servicemembers Civil Relief Act protects you specifically. A landlord cannot override this protection, even through a lease agreement. Now let's address the most common myth. People assume that once a landlord decides to raise rent, they can do it by any amount, at any time, in any way they choose. No, it cannot happen without proper notice. It cannot be done for discriminatory purposes, and in some states, it cannot exceed a certain limit. But I also have to be honest, in most states, as long as the rules are followed, yes, a landlord can impose significant increases. They have that right, but it is not unlimited. The lease matters, the expiration date matters, and of course, the state you live in matters. That is precisely why having all of this information changes everything. Instead of panicking when that envelope arrives, you can ask yourself, is this in writing? Has my lease ended? Which state am I in? And the answers to those three questions can, in many cases, buy you months of time. Knowledge is that concrete of a thing. Learning your rights only when you need them is like searching for an umbrella in the rain. If you want to learn before it's too late, Rights Illustrated is here. Subscribe. It might come in handy one day. See you in the next video.